Yes.
He's a doctoral fellow at Bauhaus University, Weimar, where she pursues a historical and ethnographic research project on the nexus between performing arts and position rituals in Burma. She has published several articles on music and atmosphere. Her edited volume, Music and Atmosphere, which she co-edited with Jude Tornian, is about to be published with Routledge next year.
Thank you very much for this really kind, generous invitation. And I enjoy the conference a lot, also because of the very broad diversity of scholarly kinds of work, really. And I feel I will add again and maybe have yet another genre of lecture performance for you. I'm a musicologist, so I have a perspective on affective atmospheres from musicology, where maybe some of you don't know, but the notion of affect was the dominant paradigm that was used to analyze music for 200 years, even more, in the Baroque area, where you have the musicological doctrine of affections, which deals with the body, and so this was like the paradigm according to which every musicologist would analyze music with regards to affect and affection. So the German word is Affektenlehre. Because I will refer to a few German scholars, and so I'm just circulating a little handout with the names and the date when they were born and what they did. So the first two are musicologists, Adolf Bernhard Marx and Oskar B., and they are only exemplary for the way they use the word atmosphere. So they are not atmosphere scholars or anything, but I just refer to them as examples. And then the second two, Hermann Schmitz and Gernot Böhme, they are important atmosphere philosophers, basically. And then two other terms that I'm going to use that you might not know, or that maybe I pronounce them wrong because of my non-native English. So please interrupt me when there's something you don't understand. I'm going to read my little lecture talk. So this talk is structured in 3 parts. I will first elaborate the notion of music as atmosphere, because this is what I was asked to do here, that I proposed in an article in 2015. Secondly, I will give you a glimpse into the genealogy of the German term atmosphere and its use in German music scholarship. Thirdly, I will systematically explore atmosphere by drawing on the musical concept of mode. All that which follows is work in progress. Part 1. What is the relationship between music and atmosphere? Is atmosphere merely a quality of music? Then atmosphere would lie wholly in the ears of the beholder. Do music and sound evoke, produce, generate atmosphere? If so, music and atmosphere would have to be ontologically different and linked to each other in terms of causation, one causing the other. We would thus have to conceive of music as an abstract object or virtual force that would only take effect in the real, the social, the tangible, namely the atmosphere. Or if we understand music as sonic vibration, as matter in the real, then the atmosphere caused by such vibration turns into a somewhat second layer of reality that easily slips again into the metaphysical insight of the listener. In order to collapse the ontological divide that separates music and atmosphere into cause and effect, as if they were of different ontological orders, I have tried to argue to understand sound and, by extension, music as atmosphere. This thesis departs from 8 founding observations. Originally I have six in my abstract, now there are 8. More to be added. First, atmosphere is not an ancillary effect of music making, but music making is abundantly about atmosphere. Second, in many situations, music is heard and experienced as atmosphere, and not, for instance, simply as sound that would produce atmosphere. Third, music seems to hold some kind of affective power to penetrate situations, collectives, and selves, and manifest as atmosphere among them. Fourth, and related to this, it seems insufficient and unsatisfying to simply identify the feelings we sense in music with the soul or self of an individual listener. Fifth, atmosphere can be sensed as something present irrespective of how each individual might feel about it. Sixth, atmosphere cannot simply be located in music or in sound, as it is irreducible to the auditory realm, as we just saw. Seventh, both the musical or the acoustical are important dimensions of any situations, I argue, that manifests as atmosphere. And finally, there is a striking structural similitude between music, sound, and atmosphere. Thus, the methodological challenges they each pose overlap, prompting us to think atmosphere through music and music through atmosphere. This brings me, enough with the ontology, this brings me to the second part of my talk, and to the question, what do I mean by atmosphere? Aesthetic theorist Gernot Böhme and many others after him have argued that atmosphere is a metaphorical appropriation of a meteorological term. Yet the genealogy of the term in German language tells a more complex history of semantic shifts that, from its inception in the late 17th century, render vague the very difference between metaphorical and meteorological meaning of the term. In fact, I have found the term atmosphere in medical handbooks and pharmaceutical lexica from the 18th and 19th century. Here, atmosphere is not a meteorological, but a medical concept. In these texts, atmosphere referred to the material yet aerial matter that the human body emanated, just as celestial bodies would cast vaporous stuff. This corporeal effluvia was of immense importance for olfactory medical diagnostics, so was the nose. Moreover, contagion was said to happen in the medium of the atmosphere. Entering the atmosphere of a sick person, one risked contamination. Thus, atmosphere was inherently social in this medical understanding. It was social, it was collective, and an important concept to make sense of mass phenomena, such as cholera, but also, for instance, curious studies on fertility. So, sexual activity, literally the electricity in the atmosphere. This anthropocentric atmosphere, however, didn't only concern the medical condition of a body. According to 18th century numerology, which is the concept for affect theory, then also that is in doctrine of affects in musicology, so 18th century or earlier 17th century numerology, according to this, feelings were considered fluid matter that did not just remain contained in the body, but transpired as affective effluvia in the body's vicinity. Thus, feelings and character, an important 18th century term, character, could not only literally be smelled, how sad someone is, they also became spatial, as they would fill the room in which a person was present. So there are beautiful literary accounts of this, which I can't quote here. Atmosphere could thus announce the presence of someone in a room, or it could linger after they had left. As social media, or what Alain Corbin has called social emanations, atmospheres were telling of the emotional state of a person, but also conveyed affective knowledge about their gender, their class, their occupation. According to what you eat, that's how you smell, that's how you appear, how your atmosphere manifests. Thus, in the poetic and aesthetic use of the term, from the late 18th century towards the onwards, atmospheric scent and atmospheric sensuality came to stand in metonymic proximity rather than in metaphorical distance. When musicologists started using the term in the mid-19th century, they considered atmosphere both as a meteorological aerial medium and as a corporeal emanation. And I'll give you two examples. The first professor of music at Berlin University, Adolf Bernhard Marx, for instance, spoke of a, quote, musical atmosphere with regards to the church organ and the orchestra in the mid-19th century. For Marx, an individual tone emanated an atmosphere of overtones and timbre that endowed each tone with character. Without this atmosphere, tones would remain abstract and dry. This atmosphere, which he also calls resonant matter, or, quote, sound mass, literally gripped the listener in a church or concert hall with overwhelming power. Even though the atmosphere that emanated from tones was paratonal, by its very definition, Marx insists that it constituted, quote, the very fullness of being of tones. So this is 150 years before sound studies, right? Or 100, at least. This notion of atmosphere as corporeal emanation was also used in the study of opera, and I think that is quite important to film music, actually, around the turn of the 20th century. For instance, musicologist Oskar B., who taught aesthetic theory in Berlin and whose books and very life were forbidden by the Nazis, B. described a character on Richard Wagner's opera stage as being shrouded in an atmosphere of music. It was, however, not the singing voice which literally issued forth from the body of the operatic singer, which manifested an atmosphere about him, as you would think, according to the source domain of the metaphor, or the source domain of the word atmosphere as an emanation. But B describes the orchestra as having an atmospheric function, one that endowed the singer with an atmosphere. How? But if we still think here of atmosphere as corporeal emanation, then how could the sonic atmosphere produced by the orchestra emanate from the body of the singer on stage? The orchestra was neatly hidden in the orchestra pit. It could only be heard, but it could not be seen. It was precisely under this acousmatic condition of the hidden orchestra that the musical atmosphere could be transposed on the body of the singer. Brian Kane quotes a 19th century anonymous commentator who observes, "Imagine how much more atmospheric music becomes when it resounds unseen." Here, however, it is not the dematerialization of acoustic music that renders music atmospheric, as Kane argues. Rather, the source of emanation is substituted and transposed from the body of the instruments, from which the sound literally emanates, to that of the singer, as if the musical atmosphere materially emanated from the body on stage. Just as the medical atmosphere was telling about the medical state of the body from which it emanated, so was the orchestral atmosphere that vicariously or virtually emanated from the singer's body, indicative of the feeling state of the stage character which the singer embodied. So as if the singer was like, as in the film, as if these women embody, as if the sound comes out of their bodies, is somehow linked to their bodies in this acousmatic condition. In both Mark's idea of the atmosphere of tones and in B's idea of the atmosphere of stage characters, atmosphere is understood as a mode of appearance. Timbre and volume of sound were for Marx the very mode in which a tone came forth and gripped the body. The orchestral accompaniment of the operatic singer the singing body and voice was the mode in which a persona appeared on stage in character. So the orchestra provides the singer with a mode of appearance. This brings me to my third part and last of this talk. I would like to take this idea further and propose to think of atmosphere not simply as a spatial intensity nor as an object of perception, but instead as a mode. Atmosphere manifests, I argue, as a modulation of a scene, a landscape, a space, a time, a person. Timothy Morton, a great theorist on atmosphere, has called this process rendering, which you know from filmmaking. Atmosphere renders a world in a different hue, just as an image can be rendered in a particular color scheme. A photo filter that imbues the image and thus the memory in which it was taken with an intensive atmosphere. A landscape at night might be charged with atmosphere because the moonlight, or the absence thereof, renders the entire world in a monochrome mode of shades of black, which may even obliterate the difference between earth and sky, void and matter, human and non-human. The atmosphere of the night here is not a locatable object in the world, but a mode in which the heterogeneous objects coalesce in one characteristic color scheme. The same can be said for odors. The same can be said for odors that have no defined location in space, but rather modulate a space in its entirety. Likewise, sound can appear as an object in the world without a defined location or surface, but instead charges an entire place or situation with sonorous intensity. Sound can be used actually in both ways. It can also be quite local, right? Sound and music modulate the way in which the world shows up. But why are modes particularly atmospheric? I suggest that music actually provides us with the epistemic tools for analyzing musical atmosphere in terms of mode. So, what is a mode? A mode, in the modern sense of a scale, determines the pitch relationship in a musical piece. A mode provides the tonal material in which music unfolds, and thus always affects a musical piece or improvisational process in its entirety, until a new mode comes in by way of modulation, a new track a new movement, a new morning, a new season, a new feel. Musical modes have a strong affinity to moods and to being atmospheric because they are not an object in their have no being in their own right, but they affect, they transform the whole musical situation. In its extended sense as fashion, style, manner or way, or in German Weise, an important Heideggerian term actually, musical mode is not to be reduced to pitch relationships. Friedrich Schiller, buddy of Johann Wolfgang Goethe, Friedrich Schiller writes at the turn of the 19th century that rhythm serves as a tool, Werkzeug, a tool, to provide a dramatic production with, quote, an atmosphere because everything is subjected to the law of rhythm, end of quote. For Schiller, rhythm is a mode that combines, quote, all characters and all situations of a play into one seamless whole. Everything is in the same rhythm. But also, vocal timbre is a mode where timbre and the affective materiality of voice is pushed to the fore, for instance, by the use of the microphone. Mood can be powerfully invoked. You all know this from pop music. Since modes always concern a situational whole, they can be said to operate mereologically, a term that you have on your sheet. Mereology is the study of whole-part relationships. A scale, for instance, is structured mereologically, a musical scale. If you change one pitch or one interval in a scale, the entire scale or mode changes, and with it, the mood, like major and minor scale. You just changed like not even a full interval, just a tiny one, and the whole, it's an entirely different thing. The same is true for rhythmic modes, where only a slight alteration of a beat may invoke an entirely new genre and thus feeling. Even in the historical understanding of atmosphere as effluvia, atmosphere concerns and demarcates the whole of a persona, which is also emphasized during that time. The atmosphere is both distinctive for that person and a singular unified impression of that person, in which the numerous elements that make up a character collapse in one meaningful whole, meaningful impression. As I discovered recently, it is already in 1905 that the notion of atmosphere was first systematically introduced as an aesthetic concept into the study of the performing arts. In a lecture held in Weimar in 1905, I missed this on your list, but a lecture held in Weimar by Hugo von Hofmannsthal. Familiar? No? I can write it on the board. Great author, German author, Hugo von Hofmannsthal proposed the notion of atmosphere for the study of dramatic plays. Rather than being concerned with the relationships of the characters, he urges attention to the space between the characters. He says, the whole, the shared Dasein, being, from which they would emerge. So this is theatrical theory around the turn of the century. Quote, I could speak of the music of the whole, or of harmony, of soulfulness, Durchseelung. But this imponderable, this impalpable, this nothingness that yet is everything, I would like to term atmosphere. And then he has a whole lecture on why we have to study theatrical plays in terms of atmosphere. This lecture gets entirely forgotten. No one discusses it. Here too, Hofmannsthal emphasizes not the relationship between characters on stage, but the way they each are embedded in and emerged from the whole of the dramatic event, namely the atmosphere that holds it all together. So a Mariological concept in Hofmannsthal's terms. Following this, the study of music as atmosphere would delve into the Mariological structure of both music and sound. Indeed, precisely those musical and sonic elements that operate in a modal and thus Mariological manner seem to be critical to the dynamics of atmosphere. However, I am far from suggesting that each musical mode be mapped onto a particular feeling in a positivist manner. What is important to a mode is the modulation. So mode has to be thought of from the perspective of modulation. The threshold that sets it in contrast. So the kind of atmosphere theory that I propose is a threshold theory, following also on the work of Marcel Corbuson's notion of threshold. Even the most monotonous techno beat eventually breaks. The music of percussion ensembles in Burma that I study heavily uses this musical technique of invoking atmosphere. Music here is structured in alternating slow and fast passages. The rhythmic drive of a song performed by the percussion orchestra breaks into another faster rhythm that pulls and drags people on the dance floor in front of the orchestra. This break is abrupt, yet not without its own quality. Instead of just speeding up, the slow rhythm modulates into a fast rhythm in a very complex manner, thus affording a threshold experience that seems to be crucial to atmosphere and, following Marcel Corbuson, is also fundamental to the spiritual fabric of the situation. After all, this music that I study is used in possession rituals that allow for existential transformations between human and nat or spirit, human and animal. Let me summarize. The most critical structural features of modal thinking, what I kind of propose here, is the following. First, modes are structured Mariologically and operate Mariologically as they always relate to and transform the whole of an event, thereby generating a sense of ubiquitousness and seamless coherence, which is characteristic of atmosphere. From this follows, second, that atmospheres are prone to the use and abuse of power. Just as a ruler can be said to subjugate a country, atmosphere wields authority. It, as you say in English, prevails. In German you say atmosphere rules. It's the subject in the sentence, right? It wields authority. Not only do resistance movements or jazz sessions mobilize atmospheres to life-affirming ends, but also concentration camps are driven by atmosphere. Third, modes are always in the plural. There is not one musical culture that I know of that only has one mode in the sense of scale, as in that case, the concept of mode and melody would collapse. So you need at least two modes in order to have a concept of mode in a musical culture. Fundamental to mode is the observation that one and the same musical piece can be fashioned in a different mode without losing its identity. Thus, the affective atmospheric power of mode is most tangibly mobilized in moments of modulation, at the very threshold where one mode replaces another. Threshold moments are, for this reason, particularly atmospheric and suggestive. Examples include the notorious sunset, the threshold between day and night, but also a revolution as a threshold between autocracy and democracy, or when a string ensemble starts playing with the damper, At all these points, atmosphere is made tangible. Thinking atmosphere as the manifestation of a musical or sonic modulation is to focus on its modes of appearance rather than on the mode of perception. The modal thinking, which I have tried to sketch out here, is thus less related to Michel Chion's modes of listening, for instance, but has closer resonances maybe with Bruno Latour's modes of existence, and thus with the many modes of existence of listening beings. Tiny last paragraph. For the sake of this talk, I have deliberately succumbed to a certain conceptual intellectual shorthand in making general statements about music and sound and atmosphere, as if these had a Platonic existence outside the diversity of auditory cultures and historically grounded philosophies of music and the human. The study of music as atmosphere, however, must begin with a close listening to the culturally inflected and musical situations and the diverse ontologies of sound, music, and feeling. And I hope this event will provoke many more such studies. My own research on Burmese transformation rituals hinges, for instance, on the Burmese term for affective atmosphere, a compound noun made up of the three words feeling, social collective, and vaporous emanation. Thank you. Yes, Darcy.
Thank you for a great paper. I always learn so much from you. I wanted to see if you could tell us more about, because in previous work that you've done, you talked about becoming, atmospheric process of becoming. So here is the first time I've heard like rendering. So I was wondering if you could talk about the difference between these two concepts, or how they inform each other, or when should we, like, you could just expand on rendering, but.
Yeah, so rendering is basically this comes from Timothy Morton, and he derives it himself from film theory, which I can't really talk about but it's a technique of when you have put all the film strips together in one piece, then you render the whole film, right? So you
like marriage print, where it's rendered into a new edit.
Yeah, in a new edit, and then. It's like a color scheme, for instance, that could be put also on a photo, like a filter, basically. And my argument is that musical mode is like this. Musical mode is also a rendering. I could, for instance, render any song in a minor mode. I could sing a song for you in a major mode, or render it in a minor mode. And therefore rendering, I would say, is a mereological concept in this sense. So the interesting thing about this kind of mereological thinking, or modal thinking, is that you have a different kind of causality. That maybe it is wrong of me to say that opposing cause and effect. Maybe it's better to say that there is a new causality coming in. When you sorry, I got a little bit lost. so when you render a piece, or when you put a musical piece into another mode, then you change the whole, and the whole changes the parts, which is also a concept in which climate actually was conceptualized by early climate research. Let me give you an example from my flight to Beirut. I've been flying with American Airlines, where there's a law that no longer the stewardesses are casted as models, but apparently the Middle Eastern airline doesn't have that, and the stewardesses all look like models, like very cliché hot women, right? And for me, it changes the atmosphere. So it's not necessarily the effect that the particular woman, this particular lady, has on me, maybe there's a sexual tension between me and her. Could be. That's interesting. That's a affective situation, a situation of affect. But the situation of atmosphere, I would say, is different from that, because by the very presence of these very gendered bodies that are performing femaleness in a particular way, I am changed. I am part, all of a sudden, of this very gendered femaleness. And I feel as if I'm seen by every other male passenger on that plane as a variety of this stewardess body. So it's not the effect that the stewardess has on me, it's that the whole is changed by this one alteration of this stewardess body, and thus gender becomes atmospheric. This is what I would call the atmospheric mode. It's a modulation of the whole, even though nothing changes in my body, in my head, nothing really changes, but it's a new. So, for instance, sentiments maybe also operate atmospherically, one could say, and then and then the becoming is happening in this little relation between whole and part. So it's not the becoming of me, of all of a sudden becoming a highly gendered, sexualized body, is not because of this relationship between the stewardess and me. It's because of the relationship of me in this whole situation that is created by the setup. I'm talking here about a philosophical concept, right? This is only an example, but maybe an important one.
So mode is also kind of policy in a way.
Exactly. So politicians also have to live by modes if they employ one. Yeah.
But just to underline that rendering means sometimes synonymous to reducing.
Right.
Like reduction.
Oh, I see.
Some sort of reductionism.
Oh, interesting. Right. Yeah. Marcel.
Yeah. First, I thought, why do you use the word mode and maybe not stay to your German heritage and use the word Stimmung by Heidegger or Bejunen, as it is sometimes translated in English. But then I thought, no, both are not the right words. And so I was actually surprised when Darcy said that you previously used the word becoming, or was working with this concept. Because, well, the point that I want to make is mode seems to be too static. So when you would use the word, so I would perhaps rather search for, to change from a noun to a verb. So more thinking about like a movement, like modulating as a verb. And I also try to present my thresholds as a dynamic event, as something that is constantly occurring.
Right.
And mode is like too fixed thing.
Right. Yeah, very good point. So Hermann Schwitz, the philosopher of atmosphere, we could say, who has the phenomenology of atmosphere, he says in one text that basically you can't use nouns. You have to think of this. You have to do phenomenology in verbs only. So I'm a big fan of speaking in verbs. This is why I prefer the word modulation over mode. So to not think mode as the static concept, but to approach mode from the perspective of modulation. So it's always an operation, it's always a rendering, it's always something that is performed and is happening in performance. And these thresholds only make sense then precisely in this process. And Stimmung is, I don't use Heidegger's Stimmung because it's too ontological. It concerns being, right? It is related more to Dasein rather than to modes of existence, so to say. But yeah, there's the phenomenology of Heidegger and then the phenomenology of Schmitz are quite far away from each other in a philosophical argument. Yeah.
But to follow on from
Right.
Marcel's point, doesn't the same thing apply to rendering, which is, as a digital metaphor, seems to have limitations also, because it's rendering is moving towards a finality, whereas atmosphere is something that's constantly in flux. Even your story about the flight attendants, that could completely change.
Oh, totally.
Suddenly change their minds about that. Whereas rendering, you're always talking about reducing down to a final cut. It's in a way a destructive, kind of destructive element.
Yeah.
To take the audio term. So, yeah.
That's a very good point, actually, and also makes the metaphor maybe unusable in a way, because modulation is not arriving at some final. After every scale comes another mode. There's no final mode. Maybe that's true. Maybe that doesn't work.
I find that a lot with Timothy Morton's metaphors, that they're great and inspiring, but then they're sort of unusable.
Suddenly full. Well, I've never even given that a thought, but yeah, that's true.
Maybe there is some sort of human agency involved. Who
Sorry?
is human agency?
Human agency.
Who is rendering human? Atmosphere is generally a non-human phenomenon. Like it's there, existing outside of the human conscience. The humans, they intervene and render something for their own consumption, entertainment, and such and such. So
Yeah, but that has no relationship to rendering as a digital process.
okay, rendering.
Rendering as a digital process is something you set going and then you go away and have a meal or.
Yeah, to talk about who's doing what, who is producing the atmosphere is yet an entirely different topic that I try to not touch on here.
And,
So,
I'm working on a book manuscript about this auditory setting about human agency of atmosphere.
Right. Oh, interesting.
Rendering is a very crucial concept.
Yeah.
But the relationship to possession that you made is, which you sort of went over very quickly, but that seems extremely interesting.
Yeah, that's, for instance, a modulation. You can think of this as an existential, very existential modulation. Then maybe Heidegger's Stimmung would be usable again. The very Dasein is at stake.
But it's not Dasein who determines the Stimmung.
Stimmung is determined by Dasein.
No. It's the Stimmung who determines the Dasein.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Exact. I agree. Yeah. Stimmung determines this. Yeah. Yeah. After Heidegger, the German phenomenologists have focused more on have used psychological studies to discuss atmosphere and Stimmung, and not anymore this ontological distinctions. Thank you very much.
He has a PhD in regional planning and public policies. His research deals with the relationship between urban and regional planning, public policies, and social environment. Such relation explores new potentials for urban regeneration, particularly processes and local development.
Thank you for that. I will just a couple of minutes to set up. Sorry for that.
Do you need us to close the curtains?
I think it's fine. I like this slide. It's not important. Just to follow the discussion. So sorry, just one moment. It's a bit hard. Sorry for this. Okay, so thank you. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for the invitation, Buddha. I'm really happy to be here. This is oh, just running. For those who were at the concert yesterday night, I was presenting some of the field recordings I'm now discussing about today. And I don't know why it is. No. Start. Okay, here we are. This paper is talking about the shape of urban atmosphere to come, and I'm trying to reflect about how we perceive and how we are affected by urban atmosphere, and as a provocation, how we possibly design urban atmosphere through different kind of possible actions like public policies, for example, but also through art and practices in general. So I was meant to title, to name this paper, Plural Identities and Multiple Affectivity and the Shape of Urban Atmosphere to Come, but then I realized, I was mentioning more and more the terms authenticity and the term alliances. So these are maybe the two concepts I want to concentrate on during this presentation. And of course, I want to try to stress and challenge more and more the term authenticity, and try to find new possible understandings for these alliances, for the definition of alliances. Of course, I'm trying to do that by using a case study I was involved in the city of Palermo. I spent in Palermo some days recording, but also reflecting on the most, from a sonic perspective, the most active and the most vibrant places in town. And during an art residency, I decided to focus my attention on the historical markets there. And through the listening of these markets, I was trying to understand how the cultural identity of the city was developing. And especially, I was focusing my attention on the street cries of the vendors, which made the atmosphere of these places incredibly unique and really, we could say, the identity of the place lies also there, and it creates a really interesting world of sounds, of voices, of dialogues between vendors. This is a really evocative place. So I decided to explore the markets, and especially I was interested by their vocal production. In their dialect, it's called Abbagnata. So I will refer to Abbagnata. So when I talk about Abbagnata, I'm talking about the cries of the street vendors. So that became the focus of my my listening investigation. And as you can see, this is just a scheme of the city, of the historical part of Palermo. I was experiencing completely different atmospheres in the different markets. And of course, not only the loudness of Abbagnata, but also the way it was performed by the traders was completely different. Especially, I was really interested about the difference between the vocal production and also the importance of their speech during this silent moment. So they were actually trying to interact with people through their voices. But I could listen to different environments, and if you see, I was trying to map and mark the different shades of Abbagnata. So in the market of Ballarò, which is this one, the presence of Abbagnata was really strong. There was really a multitude of sellers crying and kind of singing their as a way, as I said, as a way of presenting their goods for better selling them. In other situations like Mercato del Capo or Bucceria here, the experience of Abbagnata was less intense, as the market was facing a critical situation because of a lot of problems related also to the neighbor themselves. So there was a strong connection, as I realized, between the neighborhood and of course the market, and how the market was in a good condition or not, was presenting itself as a healthy place or not. So the most critical neighborhood, especially Bucceria, showed a loss in this practice, in this everyday practice, and that was really remarkable. Also because Bucceria had a strong and really difficult past. That was the place, the area of the city which was bombarded by the Americans during the Second World War, and after that it was never completely redeveloped. So it was the most critical part of the city, and still is right now its market is kind of vanishing because of the so many factors, the rise of street commerce in general, but also the way how the neighborhood itself affects the healthy state of this market. So the first and important thing I was noticing was this difference between the markets through the production and performance of Abbagnata. And it was really important for me to understand how the city was changing, and how the cultural identity of the city was changing. I was structuring the first during the first time I was there my residency in two parts. The first part was about asking all the vendors how about their practice, how they learned it or not, whether they were performing it or not, and how and why. And so I collected all this material together, producing then a kind of audio documentary out of it. And then I was also recording their voices, producing an audio piece, which was part of the material you listened to yesterday night. So these two materials together were trying to combine my ideal balance between academic research on the policies and the planning issues of the city, and both and also the way how to evoke this traditional vocal practice. I was really interested about the loss of a bagnata. So this really traditional element of the city was vanishing. Of course, under the pressure of let's say capitalist economy, and this loss was really important to me because I was trying to figure out how whether I could consider a bagnata as a cultural identity to be safeguarded, and how to safeguard this vocal production. So if the market is running really good, then automatically we could say the bagnata would continue to be performed. But as a matter of fact, the market itself is losing its energy, its vibrancy. So this practice itself is just going. And of course, also the market sellers were kind of aware of it, but they were accepting this situation as a condition, as a matter of fact. While my intention was to present this vocal production as a really important feature of the cultural identity of the city. So it was not about safeguarding and something which was not changing, putting it like this as something you put it in a museum, but it was something. It was a critical element for people to be aware of how their environment and their atmosphere was changing. So I actually had the chance to come back this year after 4 years in Palermo, and I was asked to lead a sound walk through the same markets I was studying 4 years before, and I was really interested about how the situation would have changed, and of course I could feel from an atmospheric perspective a lot of transformations going on. The city now is attracting more and more tourists, so this touristification process is completely changing the way our markets sound now. And in one of the markets, some tourist guides were leading groups through the market, and of course the market itself is kind of accepting and transforming in order to welcome all these tourists. So also the way how they speak to the people is changing. They're no more using local dialect. They're no more screaming. They're no more crying. They're just presenting their goods through as straight as possible Italian, at least, or even some English, even though it was critical for them to speak, for most of them to speak English. But so the way how they react to the environment, to the situation, completely modify the atmosphere of the place. I was also discussing with some people from the city, local people who made me realize that once, even just 4 years ago, sellers were not supposed to offer you, for example, orange juice in the market, which was just an example to say that they were just presenting their goods, and now they are trying to figure out how to attract tourists, presenting also like traditional Sicilian, really stereotypical foods or whatever beverages like orange juice. I inside my paper I'm trying to use it as much as possible what I could learn from this experience and how to think about how the city are changing and how the tourism is also modifying and domesticate the local production of the market sellers. And more in general, I'm trying to understand, to think about these two words I was mentioning before. What about authenticity? How the market is still presenting itself as an authentic place to be. So how long are tourists going to be attracted by its authenticity, or just they go there because the guide tour lead them there. And of course, I'm using a lot of references, a lot of theoretical reflections, which are part of the paper. But today I was more interested in talking with you about my experience there. When I was fascinated about the idea of alliances and loss of alliance between human and non-human, and also about how these alliances, which are basically not just about urban policies, for example, regulating the way how the licenses of the markets are regulated, but also about how the social relations are created, and also about how the coexistence between humans and goods, and of course how the artistic practice could help in make people acknowledge the importance of local tradition like this. So I ended up thinking about how the historical markets were under the pressure of this capitalist atmosphere, which is actually pervasive and ubiquitous, and is in order to survive is trying to reproducing its ideal features. I was thinking about, of course, for example, the Venice reproduction in Las Vegas. So these kind of things, what is the sonic atmosphere or the atmosphere in a wider sense of a completely reproductive, completely copied version of stereotypical and beautiful places like Venice, for example. So authenticity is, of course, really a challenging term, and what can we do as human being? We can just think about our sense of intimacy, and we can also refer to the tonality of this specific atmosphere, and reading and listening through them, trying to be as much aware as possible of these transformations, of course. So I was really interested about perceiving the city through the everyday practices which are going on there, and for me this process of listening to this affective atmosphere is the first step toward new political alliances to come. So of course they should be political. This discourse is really political in the way that it is not about being aware of the transformation themselves of a single aspect of our everyday atmosphere. Is about how these aspects, these elements constituting the traditional atmosphere are just losing without our agency. So I was trying to reflect on this sense of coexistence, informed by, of course, by our sensorial body and by the oral, which could be one of the way we could monitor as well the public space and how it reflects the political situation. So, thank you. I have also some field recordings if you want to, for those, yeah, please.
I have one question. What are your observations when you move away from the zones that you studied? What happens there? In the periphery of the traditional markets which are affected by the global markets and tourism and stuff.
No, that's an interesting point. Actually, I wasn't able to study the suburbs and the periphery, the outskirts of the city. It's also quite a big city, but I was concentrating about the historical markets because they are really traditional. So it's like the place where this kind of local practice were developing through ages, and so that's basically why I decided to concentrate my attention.
I have actually two questions. One related to your use of word authenticity, which is kind of problematic.
Exactly.
And second, I was thinking whether you can replace authenticity by locality or site specificity. But at the same time, I was thinking it's a kind of question for me also generally in my work. We need advocate for underlining or emphasizing locality or protecting, safeguarding locality. If we relate it to authenticity, then there is a danger that nationalistic inclinations might be kind of triggered, protecting national pride or national tradition. Do you find this kind of equation dangerous, or how do you negotiate?
That's really interesting, and I agree with you that it's a problematic word, but I think that we should use problematic words and be aware of their potential. I'm also really curious sometimes to use the term identity, which is even more problematic sometimes. But I also think that we should be aware that, for example, the identity is something in continuous transformation. So if we think about the term as a really fixed term instead of a flux, then we can fall into the authoritarian issue that you were mentioning before, which of course is really problematic. But if we consider them as a plural instead of singular, first of all, and then as a continuous transformation, then we understand that of course they have a value, and they let us understand how our affective atmosphere are changing every day and why. So if we don't mention identity as plural and transforming continuously, we will never, we just let something go without reflecting on them. That's maybe my point. And it's interesting because, for example, in Italian, identity is identità, which is both singular and plural, and I always use this as a way to communicate with people and say, okay, listen, we're not talking about identity as singular, but as a plural noun, and always like this is the same as a community. In Italian, it's comunità, which is the same, singular and plural, the same word. So we should think about this more, but I don't want to avoid some problematic words. Instead, I want to build something on them.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, nevertheless, you're speaking of a loss of identity.
Exactly.
So I also had the same, well, problem or question as Buddha had. I was hearing like the resonances of Murray Schafer here, like kind of idealization of the past. So let's keep it as it was once, because then it was good, and now it has changed due to capitalism and tourism and all the other things. I mean, things get lost. So for me, it had very much the flavor of this restorative thinking that is also prominent in Murray Schafer's. So I wonder how much that affects you, and if we are also not on the point of changing that paradigm and being more open to these. I mean, you're talking a lot about transformations, eternal transformations going on, but still there's this. It seems like there's this kind of ideal situation, kind of stable situation in the past when these street vendors were still prominent. I wonder, for example, if on a social level this is something that we should strive for. I think these guys, these street vendors, were among the poorest people that were living in Palermo. So maybe it is for them, for themselves, it's not a very bad thing that things have been changing.
Okay. Of course, I didn't want to refer. I didn't want to. I didn't want to think about this abbagnata, this vocal production, as something to preserve. I was just trying to be as provocative as possible on the term authenticity and how to possibly safeguard it. But it was just a provocation, and of course, I do believe that things are changing constantly. I just wonder if we are aware of it or not, and how this transformation affects our experience of the urban atmospheres. So this is more about this. It was more about our listening practice could help us to understand more and more also the political situation in which we live. So it was not about restoring an authentic world. It was more about reflecting through listening about this transforming situation. And then, of course, I was trying to develop the idea of designing atmosphere. So, of course, again, safeguarding for me is a really provocative word, provocative term. And I am not into restoring as it was the same glorious past. It's more about what are the instruments, the tools we have to possibly design the atmosphere, and also challenge this design process if it's something we can really do or not, if we have the power enough to do or not, if we engage with the human atmosphere in a critical way or not. So all this academic and artistic process is about this. It's about challenging these problematic words. But I was not meant to refer dogmatically to Schaffer at all. Yeah. I don't know if I answered your question.
Just to push this a bit further, the interesting thing is that in talking about this environment, there's a tinge of nostalgia to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
Yet in the work you presented last night, you project this medieval scene into hypermodernity.
Mm-hmm.
So your own role is seems in a sense conflicted. And I mean, I think this applies to any of us who work in this way. You know, it's maybe a productive conflict, but it kind of reveals the problematic nature of this situation. In the work itself, you're almost ruthless.
You're almost
ruthless in projecting it into this new world. So I wonder what you think about that.
I don't know if I get your question.
Well, maybe there isn't a good question in there. It's a conflicted state, I think, between a certain degree of nostalgia, you know, which is a kind of resistance to a type of change that we are critical of. And yet in our work, all of that nostalgia disappears. Or not all of it, but most of that nostalgia disappears. And we're quite happy to transport the market into a completely hyper-modern atmosphere.
Yeah, no, I think that it's an exercise of thinking on different levels about the piece, and as I said before, and also as you mentioned before, trying to find a balance between an artistic practice and an academic and a theoretical one. Maybe let you also develop different languages to deal with this kind of issues. So maybe this is why the performance I was presenting yesterday and this presentation were kind of combined together in a way, one informed the other and vice versa. I didn't let you listen to the recordings for those who didn't, so I'm sorry for that. If you want, I can play it now. Or if not, we can just finish it. It's fine for me.
If you have something online, you can provide the links.
Yeah,
Later,
sure.
Time constraint.
Yeah.
We are not keeping time that much. The organic development of discussion to be encouraged, but we are slightly late. But we'll continue with that, being late, delayed, time stretched, or might be stressed. Well, that's one part of this game. Our next presenter is Maria Papadomanolaki. She's a Greek sound practitioner and researcher currently based in London. Our work and research focus on creating collaborative listening experiences, often in sites associated with transience, either in the form of telematic soundworks, outdoor listening events, durational broadcasts, or workshops. Papadomanolaki is interested in investigating sound in response to placemaking, perception, and memory.
Thank you, Buddha. And thank you for inviting me here. Thank you all for your presentations and your provocations and questions and discussions. This is important for me to experience for many reasons. I find bias problematic, I have to say. One thing that is not mentioned in this bias is that I'm also currently working as a senior lecturer and course leader for digital music and sound arts course at the University of Brighton. That's not a very important information, but since everybody is mentioning their positions in academic institutions, I thought it would be useful to know. And today, I'm going to be attempting to talk about my practice. I find it quite difficult to talk about atmosphere, about such a, complex and fleeting concept that has lots of different approaches depending on who's talking about it from their own experience. And also, it's difficult for me to talk about what I do in relation to atmosphere. So what I will try to do today is to zoom out and try to communicate to you the connecting thread across different things that I've done, where atmosphere is present, and connect this presence of atmosphere with also the use of text as a means to create exchanges and engagement with site specificity. So, about my practice, as already mentioned in my bio, my practice engages with three different, let's say, overlapping axes. So site specificity, text, and listening. Text, as I've managed to kind of like zoom out and observe, actually plays a very important role in how I engage with the site, how I excavate it and perceive it and sound it. So it is something that it's there, and I use it in many different forms, as I will be discussing later on. By site specificity, I also need to explain that I'm referring to urban environments. I've been living in big cities for more than 15 years. So cities have become a very important, agent in how I live and how I breathe and how I listen. So I mainly engage with these environments, these constellations, rather than, escaping to a rainforest or something exotic. I go straight into the middle of this and trying to understand what my role and my effect is within the urban environment. Further to that, by urban environment, I'm also more specifically interested in sites that are characterized or affected by a certain essence of change or transience, either that by purpose or design, functionality if you may, or because they're undergoing a process of transformation. Sites that either themselves are transforming or degenerated, or are in the middle of an agenda, and their use and character is impacted by what's happening around them. I like to refer to these sites as pass-through because I just, observe how I react to them. I mainly commute or pass through them. I don't really engage them in the way that I would engage in my home. In a way, when I use text, this text becomes both an instrument and a prompt for me to tune into these sites and to engage with them differently, to observe them, to listen to them, to excavate them, to reflect, to decompose, recompose, and kind of examine the different layers of the site, but also how I am placed in this constellation. So what I do is site-specific, but also the text that I use is site-specific itself by its very nature. Before starting writing my own texts, I was very hesitant. I really felt that text and the dynamics that words have in my imagination and in my listenership, they were there, but I was hesitating to use my own text. So when I started this whole process, I found texts that were resonating with me in different ways. And so I drew from, let's say, the history, the methodology of psychogeographical writing. I was particularly interested in the genealogy and tradition of the London psychogeography, which is very wide, very male, where you can call it whatever you want. So I was basically reverse engineering it, taking pages out of a book and using them in a way to break them apart and try to see them from my own perspective as a reader. As I will explain later, my own idea of readership and of text, it might affect how we read things, but we also bring in our own understandings and our own moods and readings and associations to a book. It's for me a page filled with words is an open canvas. So text is the catalyst, but also the work in progress creation of this iterative methodology that I've developed and that I use in many of the projects that I do, the site-specific projects, that involves walking around, walking in a site many times, many iterations, listening, writing, reading. You can understand reading as a way of also researching about a site, reading about the history, reading interviews, talking to local people, writing, excavating, and trying to stop and engage with something that otherwise I would pass through. So it's an iterative process. For me, the text, in a way, the texts that I'm creating are also prone to this fragmentation of this kind of like multiplicities of perspectives and sensitivities. The texts that I make are as fragmented as the different perspectives that I'm, engaging with, and they carry elements of the environment, the affective tonalities, the textures, the histories, the politics, the personal resonant themes, the emotional, the social undertones of an environment that I engage with. So for me, once the text is read or written, acts like a prompt, more like if I want to make a parallel to how John Cage had the songbooks or maybe the Fluxus event scores, where these are open scores for different approaches and interpretations. I'm using the text as a prompt, as a score to create something. But so what happens after that can take different forms and different shapes. So it can be a performance, it can be a workshop, it can be a songbook, but the text is there as a backdrop to inform the practice. As I said previously, I'm interested in the dynamics between what the words can do to the imagination and the perception of a site. The words of a text in my practice are there to be internalized and be felt as a trace in the actual site and social plane. So when I'm there, I'm not having a piece of paper reading the text. I've spent time with the text, read it, it's resonating with me. So whenever I go back to this iterative methodology, it's there, but it's also not there. It's in absentia. I'm using the word shifter here. It's a shifter that can assume different meanings to different people when I'm using it, for instance, as part of a workshop, and can also be assigned to different aspects of an environment, material or immaterial. I'm referring here to how Rosalind Krauss borrows the attempt by Jacobson to emphasize on the importance of the shifter as something empty, whose signification shifts depending on the context and the meshwork of interactions that it becomes part of. So it's nothing more than a trace that is triggering in my sensitivities, my memories, my inclination, something that cannot be sensed immediately, but it's there as a blurry presence, not unlike the atmosphere of a site. Yet it's something that instigates perception and perceptual motions and exchanges. Let me see how can I zoom out. Is it too silent? In terms of what I create as part of the different projects that I've been doing, as you can see here, I have like lots of different samples of text that I've created. You can assume different shapes and forms depending on the context or of the size. For instance, you know, some instances it can become like a more complex poem. In other cases, it's like a fragmented diary entry. Or it can be like a scorecard for a workshop, or it can be an audiovisual piece, like in this example here. So this is a video, I don't know if you can see it, but I created for one of my telematic performances. It's called A Certain Geography in Motherhood. A Certain Geography is a series of site-specific soundbooks that I've been doing. And this is one of the most challenging projects that I've done because it deals with a quite internal atmosphere and environment, that of motherhood. And for this, I streamed a live soundbook from a park in my neighborhood where I used to take my daughter in the ground to put her to sleep. And this soundbook was then streamed live in a gallery in Athens as part of a festival in 2016. So A Certain Geography, this series of soundbooks, investigates actually the creative tension between the remote locations. Here, where here is an audience situated in a listening room, and there is a roamer, a streamer who sends live soundscape that she encounters. This particular soundscape and the experience that the listeners have is expanded through the use of my body, sometimes my voice, to amplify the acoustics. When I research a site, I also find objects that I then use and incorporate in the performance. So I use them to interact with surfaces and other acoustics in the space. I create a site-specific text, which is then transformed into a video piece, and sometimes the interaction is also enhanced with interaction through social media. So I share my Twitter hashtag, Twitter handle, and a particular hashtag, and people can interact with me as I walk. They can ask me questions, they can share their listenings, and create this kind of like shared listening experience. From the different iterations of the process that I've done, and from people's responses, this very complex and difficult relationship between the transmitter and the receiver often takes a very personal, intimate character, which is very unique to each one of the listeners. And often goes beyond the thresholds of what is immediately perceived. You know, the actual acousmatic sound of the incoming sound, the acoustics of the sound itself. It's something that where memory and reflection often plays an important role. In this case, the video establishes a connecting point across the remote locations and an atmosphere, if you like, for tuning in. The video, when it's projected in the auditorium, usually the auditorium is like a dark room where people are sitting down and listening, and they can then, interact with me if they wish. In the case of this video, of the motherhood piece, the video acted as a supportive atmosphere to the incoming remote sound of the busy playground. So when I did this performance, it was 5 p.m. In May, so it was a very busy time of the day after school. The particular park has different playgrounds, so I designed a path, trajectory that would cross the different playgrounds. So very busy playgrounds, children playing, mothers pushing the prams, and as this sound was coming in to this remote location in Athens, in enclosed space in a gallery. The video shared my fragmented meanings and experiences and sounds of the newly then discovered experience of motherhood. In a way, what I'm attempting to do with this text-based video is to kind of reverse engineer what subtitles do in a film, kind of like using the this kind of like cinematic convention, but not as an authority that bridges meanings and languages, but more like a means for prompting exchanges. And you know, it's there and people can either pay attention to it or not at all. They can close their eyes and focus on the sound if they wish. There's no expectation from me, from my end, that they engage with the text if they don't want to. There is, I want to kind of borrow an analysis that researcher Sina has written about subtitles in reference to Derek Jarman's Blue, where she underlines that subtitles are often associated with the notion of foreignness and a discourse around social and cultural politics and policies, and are rarely used in ways that negate their translational role. As in Jarman's text, I would say that the text offers to the listener, again to paraphrase Deborah Esch's analysis of the film, a film without compunction or narrative, existing only for an idea, exploring the juxtaposition of sound and image, the witnessing of an atmosphere, where the audience can listen and immerse themselves and make their own meanings and understandings and listenings. Which takes me to, I don't know if I can see the full screen here. So over the years, I've been living in different cities as a migrant artist. I became more interested in this environment that I just discussed, this pastoral environment. And I would say that a major part of what I do is to kind of like counter my tendency to flee and skim and pastoral, just make me stop and engage differently and create a transformative experience and engagement for me, but also for my listeners and companions in these experiences. As I said, this kind of like iterative process of reading and listening and walking and writing is my methodology for opening up the sites in question, both on an individual level, as me as a citizen in the cities, but also in a more collaborative communal level when I'm asking and engaging with contributions from other people and local people or the remote listeners, as in the case of the telematic soundbox. Over the years, I've been doing this practice in different sites in London. So I've engaged with Homerton Station, Liverpool Street Station, Elizabeth Park, Elephant Castle Shopping Centre, a gallery in Old Street, Canary Wharf, Regent's Canal, King's Cross, State Hill Ecological Park, Cypress Bush, and recently I've done this on the Barbican's Terrace. I've also done this in other locations, as in Vancouver, where I was streaming a soundbook from London as part of ISEA, one of the ISEA conferences. I also did it in Aix-en-Provence, where again from London, from Cypress Bush, I was streaming a soundbook back to the Mobile Audio Fest there, and other locations, the Passion of the Auto Battle City, and Rio, and so forth. In an effort to simplify the observations of all these different projects, I would say that in all these different examples, the text forms a very catalytic, I would say, role, not only in how I explored and recorded the field, but also in prompting interactions with my listeners and across obviously people and sites. So different layers of interaction, beginning with the surface. People have responded that through these projects, through the text, they engage with more surface interactions like the acoustic or material aspects or sensorial aspects of the site. For example, when I'm performing a sound walk and I'm doing things with my body in space, and there's something on the text that reflects that or anticipates that, then they are becoming more engaged with the activity and listen more attentively. In other cases, as in the case of the parasol unit, which it was an enclosed space, the space itself afforded a more rich acoustic engagement. It was a very reverberant space, so there was lots to engage with, how sound was diffused in the space and how my interaction with the space gave lots of interesting acoustic results. But also the fact that the space was very enclosed had side effects in the sound book, because actually that particular example was a live transmitted sound walk. So, as you all know, using this technology by streaming live by 3G in an enclosed space can cause a lot of disruption and glitch. So that was actually embedded in the process and the text. So the whole sound walk was prepared to respond to this challenge, and that actually then prompted a lot of vivid interactions from the part of the audience. So lots of dialogue, which is the second layer of interactions, lots of communications and conversations, lots of reflections. And all this has fed back at the text, although very sparse and subtle, created this kind of atmosphere of anticipation and tension. And they actually, one of the members of the audience said that it was gluing what they already knew about the site, because they have previously themselves walked around, with the present and future anticipations of what they will expect to listen after the piece is finished. Which kind of reminded me what we said about the perfume of somebody who is there, but then when it leaves, it lingers on and creates a particular atmosphere, this kind of temporality of atmosphere, let's say. And they also said that it kind of like this exact sense of anticipation and tension created also, it was key for this connection between what I was streaming and the transmitter and the receiver. This kind of like they were expecting for me to come back at some point, but they didn't know where that would happen. So there was a kind of like tension between me and them and how I was moving in space. In other instances, as in the example of the walk in Athens, the motherhood walk, the audience from feedback received had enjoyed the overlaps and tensions and antithesis of time between the remote soundbook and what was happening on the liminal text, which actually they felt it allowed more space to listen attentively, but also to reflect and minimally interact via Twitter. So I received a couple of people asking me where I am, and I sent a photograph and things like that of the experience. In other cases, as in Ljubljana or Liverpool Street, the specific texts that were used were actually used as in a series of soundwalks, site-specific group or individual, let's say, activities, where the participants were locals and they were asked to previously interiorize the text and perhaps pick resonant themes that they would then use, resonant themes from the text that they would then use to listen to the sites that we visited. And dialogue and conversation was quite important, and then also reflection proved to be, which is the kind of like the other layer, the deeper layer, so lots of memories and reflections through conversation. Which led to, as kind of like participants have fed back a more subjective and personal perspective to the listening, which kind of reminded me of what you were saying in your own research about contemplative listening, so hyper listening, which is this precognitive association of the sounds, that sound is a sense of triggering into a zone and into a mindfulness of experience of similar sounds. So the sounds of the station, for instance, would bring similar sounds from previous experiences or iterations of other stations, and they would make lots of different associations with memories of traveling and things like that. So this sense of contemplative listening and that kind of like is supported by the very nature of the text, which also has embedded in it this temporal layers of different listenings of the same side at different times, and maybe then the role of memory of similar sounds in other sides. So the text provides a form of, I would like to argue, fossilized atmosphere that, as explained before, establishes a sense of continuity between the past and future into the very present, and serves as a way of tuning into an atmosphere of a place, be that present, we are all together in the same site, or remote. As already explained, it supports a sense of anticipation within the constellation of atmosphere, and I would like to borrow Emendor's opinion and theory about that, who highlights that atmospheric attunement is frequently anticipated attunement, and in a sense is already in motion within the listener's perception. As much as the text might color people's reactions, it is also colored by people's personal memories, feelings, and moods. Sarah Ahmed emphasizes how intentionality plays a significant role in how we perceive and what we perceive. Affective atmospheres lie between the messiness of the experiential, the unfolding of bodies in the world, and the drama of contingency, how we are touched by what we are near. Near in a sense of intentionality, of affective memories, and of course hyper-listening. As Ben Anderson highlights, we are in the midst of atmospheres that constantly flip between the objective and the subjective, undoing the distinction between the two. In that sense, Pink and Sumatoyo invite us to understand atmosphere as an ongoing sensory and affective engagement with our lives that takes in many impressions, sensations, and feelings. And as Bern insists, atmosphere does not so much reside in place as it emerges from our ongoing encounters with it, opening up potential as we feel our way through the world, a process animated by affect, but not completely defined by it, especially extended quality of feeling. The use of text in different forms and shapes prompts and supports this ongoing engagement with our lives through sound and listening. It highlights the need to understand atmosphere as a constellation of intentionalities, materials, and environments. This form of codependence within the experiential and the emphasis on sound and listening as we feel through our worlds is what I refer to in my practice and research as a sonic perceptual ecology. In it, atmosphere acts as a trigger for tuning into our environments through our intentionalities as we see our feelings through the world and generate measurements of interactions. I also prefer to use the term counter-atmosphere to highlight the fact that site-specific work functions as a critical lens against preconceptions of finitude and staging, as well as authoritative, narrative, and hierarchies often encountered in transient urban environments. Through this constellation, the text, as a shifter, acts as a tuning fork, if you like, prompting us to imagine, contemplate, reflect, and listen. Temporality, mobility, and spatiality play an important role when discerning the details of each constellation. In my practice, when I analyze projects, I choose the term node, borrowed from Kevin Lynch, to refer to the spatiotemporal particularities of a project. Atmospheres are not generic entities, as already explained. They are site and time specific and rely on our movement to them. So in a sense, they are mobile and fleeting as we are. In this constellation, in my work, sound becomes a means to challenge all definitions and reciprocate exchanges by means of sound and voice, performance and dialogue, vulnerability as opposed to authority. The presence of an intimate and subjective voice that contemplates and communicates affective memories is therefore highlighted as an important contribution within the sonic conceptual ecology. I would like to borrow and expand here Mikhail Bakhtin's notion of the utterance and his idea about the polyphonic nature of communication, and the fact that our voices, our utterances, are a polyphonic composition of other voices and other utterances. We become who we are in speech and language through others. Our voice is inhabited by other people's words, but also other listening sounds and voices, and what we consider as our doesn't necessarily belong to us. The measure of sonic conceptual ecology is another affirmation of such a perspective because it is a field of pluralities and polyphonies. Our internal seek-through is our way of resounding these voices, of reconnecting the inside with the outside and realizing that they exist simultaneously, and that by instinct we are listeners more than viewers. Bakhtin's definition of the utterance opens this dialogue of encounters and positions each element of it in a polyphonous chain of interactions of voices affecting each other. In a similar manner, the text functions as a unique monad that in itself reflects all texts, the interconnection of all ideas, since are all realized in utterances. Thank you.